If you need a copy, just raise your hand. We're going to survey the book of Deuteronomy this evening, which is a very important book to understand because it is the capstone of the 5 books of the law, the basic revelation that God gave through Moses. And the book of Deuteronomy occupies an important place. Deuteronomy is our term or our name in English for this book, Deuteronomy, is derived from the Latin, which is derived from the Greek, and it simply means the second law. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which was made back prior to the time of Christ. This is what it was entitled there, at least the Greek form. It was a Greek term, and the Latin was adopted from that, and the English was adopted from that. So it's kind of, but that is not a misnomer because while it is not a second law, it is a restating of the law. You have to get the setting of Deuteronomy. They're standing on the east bank of the Jordan prior to the death of Moses, and prior to crossing the Jordan River and entering the Promised Land. The generation that is there is the generation that were at the oldest teenagers when they left Egypt. You remember that all of the adult generation died in the wilderness except Joshua and Caleb. You know what that means? That means there was nobody here other than Joshua and Caleb and Moses that was over 59 years old. Because everybody 20 years old and upward when they left Egypt died in the wilderness. And so you have a relatively young group. The people standing here, during the course of these weeks, it was just a matter of a few weeks that the material that we have in Deuteronomy came together. Moses gave several discourses, several addresses to the people, and set the stage for things right prior to his death, primarily in, let's say, the last month of his life. This is mentioned in the 11th month on the first day of the month of this 40th year when Moses begins this address. This is Deuteronomy 1:3. The group that is standing there really does not, for the most part, have a real clear-cut first-hand memory of the events of the Exodus or Mount Sinai. So the older ones in the group were kids, teenagers or little children. Anybody under 40 has really in a sense, anybody under about probably 45 or almost 50 would have no conscious memory. I guess the Exodus and Mount Sinai were such tremendous events that would probably made an impression on a 5-year-old, but you get much less than that. And really, so what you're looking at is anybody less than about 45 years of age would have had no conscious memory at all. They wouldn't have first-hand memory or experience of the events of the Exodus or Mount Sinai. So it is necessary to restate things. The book of Deuteronomy was written down with the purpose of being reread on a regular basis to the people. It does not contain the kind of technical information that we find in portions of Exodus, primarily in the book of Leviticus, and portions of Exodus, which were written for the priests. There was technical information that was included in the book of Leviticus, portions of Exodus, even certain portions of Numbers, not so much in Numbers, that was lengthy and detailed and somewhat technically worded because it was an instruction manual for the priests in their duty. And it contains, as you go back through Leviticus and Exodus, this is where portions of these books tend to bog people down because it gives a detailed description of the, how you make the curtains that divide the tabernacle and how you carve the knops on the posts. And most of us don't even know what knops are, much less try to figure out the posts. And it goes through the details of all of these principles dealing with quarantine and gives detailed instructions as to what you do and what you burn and what you wash and what you look out for. Well, realize that was written as a technical manual for the priests. They had to carry those things out, and there needed to be a written record as a part of Scripture that was a textbook to instruct the priests in their duty. But these were not things that were primarily designed for the lay people of Israel. So what we have in Deuteronomy is a re-summary of the basic points of the law, basic principles of the law, that the people needed to have their attention called to prior to entering the promised land. Moses knows that his life is at an end. And it's interesting, as you note here, in Deuteronomy, the first few chapters, Moses started out by saying, in effect, why are we here? And he started back at the beginning and he began to bring them forward up to this point. Now some of you may be able to identify with that, remembering how frequently Mr. Armstrong, particularly in the latter years of his life, when he would, whatever he was going to speak on, he would start back at the beginning and he would bring you up to the present time. That's what Moses did. He started back there and he said in verse 6, "The Lord our God spoke unto us in Horeb, saying, You've dwelt long enough in this mount. Turn and take your journey." And so he begins to go through recounting the events concerning Mount Sinai, recounting the events of how the Israelites came to be organized in the captain system, how they came to Kadesh Barnea. He begins to recount, to recapitulate the events of the beginning of the Exodus and the events of how Joshua and Caleb were the only spies that brought back a good report and the others didn't. Moses goes back to the beginning and he begins to recap and to kind of bring them up to date with a why are you here? Because it was important that as this generation, Moses was getting ready to end his life. He was at the conclusion of his life. He was 120 years of age. And God had told him that his life was going to end. Israel was going to enter the promised land. This is what had been 40 years in the making. And they needed to be reminded of certain material, certain things. So Moses kind of set the stage with a historical review right in the beginning, basically the first 4 chapters. And he set the stage with a historical review to kind of bring them up to date as to how they got where they were. And then you spend quite a few chapters going into laws by which Israel is to live. Really from the end of the 4th chapter from right near the end of the 4th chapter, chapter 4, verse 44, coming all the way down to the end of chapter 26, we have a summary of law. Things that applied to Israel, things they needed to be reminded of. He started out with the 10 Commandments, which are the basis of the law. And over and over and over, the emphasis throughout the book of Deuteronomy is don't add to what God said and don't take away from it. Don't change what God said. Don't alter what God said. God reveals to us the way He chooses to be worshipped. We are not to add to it nor to take away from it. We are to serve God as He specifies. Over and over that's emphasized. This warning, the warning of Israel, the warnings that God gave Israel about becoming ungrateful, about taking the credit themselves, about becoming entangled with the peoples that they came in to dispossess and picking up pagan faith. Now, have we heeded those warnings today in our society? Have we as a nation been grateful to God and appreciative? As you go through Deuteronomy chapter 8, it is a very important chapter. It is really, in a sense, a prophecy of what Israel did and what Israel has continued to do over and over and over again. It's what Israel of old did, and it's what Israel today has done. And basically, they've come into we've come into what God has given us, and we've taken the credit ourselves. Talked about in verse 14 of Deuteronomy 8, your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God. Verse 17, you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. That doesn't sound like anything our nation has said, does it? Do we remember that God is the one that brought us into this good land and gave us the choicest bounty on the face of the earth? I'll tell you, you realize as you drive, as I know my family and I have had the opportunity for a number of years now, driving right up through the midsection of this country. As during the summers we've tried to go up to visit my wife's family in Saskatchewan, which is right above North Dakota, near the North Dakota-Montana line, up north of that. And to go from this area, from Texas or Louisiana up there, you go right through the heartland of the country, up through Kansas and Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, right through the breadbasket of the world. And you drive for hours and hours and hours, and you see nothing but fields and crops and grain. Sometimes hardly seeing another human being. You can drive for 3 or 4 hours, and before you come to a town of any kind. Just go on, not on an interstate, but just on a regular U.S. highway. And you can look out just as far as the eye can see on either side and see crops, see grain crops. And you realize this is the breadbasket of the world. Just as Joseph was used by God to feed the world centuries ago in ancient Egypt, so God has used modern Joseph to feed the world, to save the world from famine, just as God used our ancestors. Because the grain exporting nations of the world are basically the United States, Canada, and Australia. That's where the grain that feeds the world comes from. And the Great Plains that extends from the Texas Panhandle on up into Saskatchewan, that is the breadbasket of not simply North America, it is the breadbasket of the world. And you look at something like that, you look as it makes the distinction, as you can look out in certain areas and just see cattle or stretched over the hills. You drive through some of these areas of the country, and there are other areas as well, but that particularly, because of the grain, is really the breadbasket. And you recognize what God has given us in this land that no other people have. And yet, what have we done as a nation? We said in our hearts that my power and the might of my hand has gotten me all this. Look at what we've accomplished. Look at what American ingenuity has achieved. We've given the credit to that rather than the credit to the great God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You know, God makes it very plain in Numbers 8 that what does he say in Numbers 8 verse 7? The Lord your God brings you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranate, a land of oil, olive, and honey. A land wherein you shall eat bread without scarcity. You shall not lack anything in it. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you may dig brass. So there's mineral wealth and agricultural wealth. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Beware that you forget not the Lord your God in not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes which I command you this day. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built goodly houses and dwell therein, when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God. Does that sound descriptive of what has happened to our nation? The more that we have prospered and the more that we've settled into goodly houses and our wealth is multiplied, the more we've forgotten God. And the further away from God and any recognition of God as the giver of every good thing, the further we've gone. To the point now that we're doing everything we can to legalize every sin that we can imagine. As though that, if God likes Sodom and Gomorrah, he'll love the United States. Right? It's incredible. I mean, every home in the country virtually has a Bible. Certain things you don't have to be converted in order to understand. Plenty of unconverted people have understood it for centuries. A lot of our unconverted parents and grandparents and people in this country and in this society for centuries have understood at least certain biblical principles. You don't have to be converted to understand anything in the Bible. A lot of physical principles, a lot of basic just principles of life can be understood, and people have understood them. And we're throwing even that aside. But, this is what Israel was warned of. Well, you could go on through the instructions here over and over, the emphasis of obeying God as God has established. The emphasis in Deuteronomy 12 on the looking to headquarters and the place where God shall choose, and the fact that everybody is not to go out and just do their own thing. The warnings in chapter 13 about if there arise a prophet or a dreamer of dreams. Certain principles in chapter 14 that dealt with food. The laws dealing with clean and unclean meats are restated here. Why would they be restated? Well, Deuteronomy, as we're going to see at the end of the book, was designed to be reread to the people every 7 years. In the sabbatical year, in the Feast of Tabernacles, the book of Deuteronomy was read in its entirety. Every 7 years it was reread to the people during the Feast of Tabernacles. It was to be a summation of the things they needed to know. It was a summation of what they needed to know. And the warnings that needed to be constantly brought back to them. And we would do well to study it from that standpoint, realizing it's a summation. A summation of the things that we need to know and need to have our attention focused back on. Israel, the generation that Moses is speaking to here, had been eating manna for the last 40 years. They hadn't had to worry about clean or unclean meat. They'd been eating manna, and that was all they had. The emphasis was restated. This was something that needed to be re-emphasized because they were preparing to enter the land. And this generation needed to be reminded that there were certain things that were not to be eaten. So that is focused on, and then he goes on into the matter of tithing, the second and the third tithe. We'll comment on that a little bit further. The sabbatical year. The holy days are focused on in chapter 16, and it's emphasized the three occasions during the year when God's people are to appear before Him. Chapter 17 deals with matter of authority. It deals with presumptuous sins, and it deals with the matter of civil government and restrictions on a king that the Israelites had set up would set over them at a later time. Chapter 18 is a reminder of certain things about God's true prophets and the prophecy of Christ, the ultimate prophet to come. Chapter 19 deals with justice and the what is to happen when in terms of crime, the cities of refuge, the principles of justice. Chapter 20 deals with regulations dealing with warfare. Chapter 21 goes on and deals with various civil matters that come up, civil and criminal matters. Chapter 22 deals with many of the same things, deals with in chapter 23. Chapter 24 deals with the subject of divorce, as well as other matters. Chapter 25, again, a lot of civil matters, things that need to be addressed. When you get to chapter 27 then, 27 through 30, we have another discourse. We have one here that focuses in on blessings and cursing. And then in chapter 31, the description of how the written law that Moses had prepared is entrusted to the leaders of Israel. And in chapter 32, we have Moses' injunction on the covenant and the song of Moses that is recorded. And then his final charge and farewell was given there in chapter 33, and the summation of the obituary in chapter 34. So there's a lot that is contained in the book of Deuteronomy as an overview. We might notice the question. We've already commented on what does Deuteronomy mean. It refers to the second law. It is a second stating of the law by Moses prior to the people entering the land. It emphasizes the way of life that they have to live in order to receive God's blessing. Now, God told the Israelites about fighting the inhabitants, the Canaanites. God told them in Deuteronomy 1 and verse 30 that He would go before them and would fight for them just as He had done in Egypt. This is what God had told Israel originally. Moses reminds them of that because Israel didn't trust God to fight its battle. So God wound up using them as a physical instrument. He even mentions in chapter 3 and verse 22 that God would fight for them. So it was a matter that Israel chose to fight. If they had really trusted God, God would have fought all their battles for them. Now we also see addressed right here in the very beginning in chapters 2, 3, 4, the area of Gilead. The area which is today the modern day nation of Jordan, that is on the east bank of the Jordan River, was the ancient area of Gilead. Bashan and Gilead and these areas where the Israelites had first encountered resistance. The tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh settled on that side of the river. Manasseh, as I think I've mentioned before, was the only tribe that couldn't get along with itself. So they wound up and half of them settled on one side and the other half went on the other side. Going back to Manasseh's descendants, he had a wife and a concubine, and there was certain rivalry there. We've seen it throughout history, and it would be an interesting study in itself, going back on the the migrations, the Israelite migrations to this country and where they originated from in the basic areas, because there actually can be mapped, and there's been research done on it, and it can actually be mapped to different sections of the British Isles, certain sections that were basically depopulated. The area of East Anglia in Britain was virtually depopulated during the 17th century. In the early 18th century, it was almost entirely depopulated in settlement to what is now New England and what spread throughout that area of the country. And it's an interesting record. Whole villages simply were depopulated. The whole population just up and moved through the period of the 17th century, 1600. There were other sections of the British Isles that relocated in other areas, and even certain sections of Germany and some of the Israelite tribes that were shifted there among the nations that were some of the early inhabitants, as opposed to perhaps some of the later settlements that came to this country that simply represented some of the other nations and come in among Israel. But you see some of these things. Well, we find here this settlement in the land of Gilead, which was, you find the term Gilead used later on in the Bible. You find it referred to a number of times. It's good to know to whom it refers. It is a term that is often used to refer to the half-tribe of Manasseh. Occasionally it is used to refer to Reuben because of the area where they were settled. We note also what God said would have been the impact on other nations if Israel had obeyed God's law. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6 through 8. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nation, which shall hear of all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. God told Israel, He said, if you as a nation will keep my laws, you will be a light to the Gentiles, a light to the nation. Other nations round about will look and see and be impressed. Israel was to set an example. They were to be a light. Isn't that what Christ said we're to do as Christians? As spiritual Israel today, that we're to be a light to the world? Isn't that what Israel is going to be finally? Israel never was, really, for very long at any given time. There are brief periods in their history when they were somewhat of a light, but it was not a sustained light. When Christ comes back, that's going to occur right at the beginning. What do we read in the book of Isaiah? How other nations will send emissaries and say, come, let us go up to the house of the God of Jacob. Let us go up to Mount Zion, to the house of the God of Jacob. Let us inquire of His way. Because they see an example being set. Or they will see. The millennium, they're going to desire, they're going to want some of that. They're going to see results. And they're going to want some of that. God told ancient Israel, He said, you go there and you set an example. And the nations will be impressed. Well, you know, instead of Israel setting an example and letting the nations be impressed with the truth, Israel was impressed with the error of the Gentile nations around them and every paganism that they could find. They thought, oh boy, isn't that something? Yeah, we never thought of that. Instead of Israel setting an example for the nations to seek to, Israel sought to the other nations. Instead of them learning the truth from Israel, Israel learned all kind of error and adopted it in and just watered the food then. That's the tendency, and that's the tendency of human nature. The warning God gives us. Not to allow ourselves to become so impressed with the world around that we try to be like this world and this society, as opposed to setting an example, being a light. Israel should have been a model that others would have wanted to follow. They never accomplished that very well. Deuteronomy 5:29, have our attention all here, says, "Oh, that there were such a heart in them that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children, forever." So that looks forward to what? It looks forward to the time when God is going to give a new heart to His people, to conversion, to the new covenant. You see, even at the time of Pentecost, that first Pentecost when Mount Sinai, there at Mount Sinai when the Ten Commandments were given, even at that point God looked forward to the Pentecost of Acts chapter 2 when the Holy Spirit would be given. He gave the Ten Commandments, but He didn't give with it the power to make the Ten Commandments a part of it. Under the Old Covenant, the Ten Commandments were written with the finger of God on tables of stone. Under the New Covenant, the Ten Commandments, the law of God, same law, is written with the Spirit of God in our hearts and in our minds. It's put within us. And that is the distinction. And God looked forward to that because He knew that there was something more. Now, Israel didn't know that. They were absolutely confident. All that the Lord has said, we will do. Well, they were quick to sign their name on the dotted line. But they didn't have a surrendered, converted attitude. They didn't have a new heart. That was looked forward to. God knew there was a lesson, there was a record that had to be written. They had to come to realize that there was more to it than what they could do on their own. See, if you can do it on your own, what do you need God for? So God needed to let the record be written that, hey, you can't do it on your own. I can give you everything except my Spirit, and it's not enough. You have to have something beyond everything else. And that's, again, a lesson, and it's a lesson we have to understand and to learn from this. God emphasized why Israel was to obey His law. You might notice in Deuteronomy 6:24. The Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that He might preserve us alive as it is this day. You know, the world doesn't understand that. They don't think that the reason you obey God is that God's law is for your good. They tend to view it as that God looked down to see everything that people enjoyed and made a law against it. And God likes to see you suffer. He wants to deprive you of things. And God wants you to go around and do penance and always be suffering and giving up everything you enjoy. And this is kind of the world's view of sin. That if it's enjoyable, you're not supposed to do it. And, you know, what was the joke? Somebody was eating something, you know, and they said, boy, it's so good, it ought to be a sin. Well, it reflects their attitude of sin. You know, it reflects their concept of sin. That if it's good, if it's pleasant, if it's enjoyable, it's bound to be something God doesn't like. And that is the very opposite. That's the devil's attitude toward God's law. Because God commands His law for our good. Why do you command your law to your children? Why do you tell your little children, don't do certain things, do certain things? For this. So you love them. You don't want them to get hurt. That's why God gives us His law. And, you know, people get all down on the case. They say, well, the law's gone away. Law is nailed to the cross. Well, why would God want to do away with a law that He said was for our good? You know, if you think it through, it simply makes no sense. It makes no sense. But I think it's important that we think it through and understand, you kind of get the big picture and realize how totally opposite the world's concept is to God. The Deuteronomy 7, we have God's instructions concerning the Canaanites and the land. He told Israel that they were to make no alliance or treaty with them. They were not to allow them to remain in the land and to try to learn any of their pagan customs. Brought out in the first 5 verses of Deuteronomy 7, also down to verses 24, 25, and 26. They instructed they were not to intermarry with them. They were to destroy their altars and all of their idols. That God also mentioned in verse 20 that He would send the hornets. He would drive out the hornets, the Canaanites with hornets, a little at a time, so the land wouldn't become depopulated and overrun with wild animals. God wanted Israel to preserve its identity. He wanted Israel to preserve its identity, not to lose that identity. And so He knew the tendency of human nature. Israel would have lost its identity from an ethnic standpoint, a cultural standpoint, a religious standpoint. In every aspect, Israel would have simply lost its identity. It would have ceased to be as a separate, identifiable group. God knew this was, of course, the tendency of human nature, of human being. And this was not to be the case. He knew what Israel would do if they, which is, when we go through Joshua and Judges, we'll find what Israel did do. They vacillated between either taking advantage of the Canaanites and making slaves of them, as we see they did. You know, they had an idea to improve on God. God told them to drive them out. When we get into the book of Judges, that Israel, some of the Israelite tribes thought they had a better idea, so they put them under tribute and made slaves of them, which is not what God told them to do. The place for the Canaanites to go, some of the Canaanites were wiped out, and others were sent elsewhere. Interestingly, you know, if you want to read the story from a Canaanite standpoint, there is a monument in North Africa. There is an obelisk that has an inscription on it in Phoenicia that goes back to this time. It says, "Here we came when we were driven forth by Joshua the robber." So that was their perspective on it. It's kind of the perspective, you know, that Palestinians from there have today. You see, we look at the story from the standpoint which God told it, but people then, just as people today, don't necessarily take God's word for it. The point was that God had a plan and a purpose that He was working out. God owns everything. God owns the earth. God created the earth, and He created the human family upon it. And it's God's prerogative to allocate it out as He chooses. It's like if you have some property, you allocate it out the way you choose. Oh, God owns the earth, and He chose to allocate the earth out to divide to the nations their inheritance, as Moses refers to in Deuteronomy 31. 36. Yeah. God divided to the nations their inheritance. He had different places for different people. There were certain... God knew that if Israel remained there with the Canaanites in the land, they would start absorbing all kinds of things. And He warned them again. Of course, they had not been zealous to really remember what God said. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, it makes plain, was Israel being given the promised land because of their righteousness? Well, absolutely not. Deuteronomy 9:5 makes plain why God gave Israel the promised land. Not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart do you go in to possess their land. Notice two reasons. For the wickedness of these nations, the eternal your God does drive them out from before you, and that he may perform the word which the eternal swore unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God says, look, there are two reasons you're getting this. Neither of them are because you're so good. Not because you're so great or so good or you deserve it. There's two reasons you're getting it. One is because they're so bad. They have gotten into all kinds of degenerate practices, right on down to human sacrifice and various things that were just the most merciful thing to do, for God to simply wipe them out and bring them up to the second resurrection and deal with them. So, for the wickedness, God sent His punishment on them because of their excessive wickedness, and He gave the land to Israel because He made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You remember at the time of Abraham, God told Abraham He wasn't going to give him the land yet because the sins of the Canaanites had not yet come to the full. In other words, things had not gotten to the point that God was going to intervene and send His judgment upon them. They didn't really quite deserve it. But just let a couple of centuries go by, and they did. Things continued to deteriorate. I would call your attention in Deuteronomy 8, where we're told why Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness. It is the answer also to the question, brethren, as to why we must live the Christian life. Israel did not go immediately from Egypt to the Promised Land, just like that. God did not take them instantly from Egypt to the Promised Land. You're not baptized and converted and just instantly transformed into a spirit being. You don't inherit the Promised Land instantly. For the same reason Israel did. Notice here, Deuteronomy 8:2. You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God led you these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and to prove you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. Now, notice here, he goes on through, he shows how He humbled them. God put them in a situation where they were unable to provide for their most basic necessities of life. God sometimes brings us to a point where we are confronted with how powerless and helpless we are as human beings to provide what we need for ourselves. God humbled Israel. He let them spend a period of time learning how totally dependent they were on Him. They were unable to provide the most basic necessities of life. You know, sometimes we find ourselves in that spot. We've been able to take care of ourselves and to kind of depend on ourselves. And God lets us get in a situation where we cannot deliver ourselves. All of us, God humbles us and He proves us. Israel was humbled because God allowed them to find themselves in a situation where they were totally dependent upon Him, and they were forced to recognize how totally dependent they were on Him. They wouldn't have, they'd have died in the wilderness if it hadn't been for miracles of God. God wanted them to recognize their dependence. You know, if they had been dwelling in a land where there was plenty of pasture and and good green pasture, and their flocks were able to feed, and they were able to harvest crops, they would have still been dependent on God, because obviously God's the one who created everything, and He gives the rain, and He gives all this. They would have been dependent on God, but they wouldn't have recognized that dependence. They would have thought, hey, we're taking care of ourselves. These crops grow because I get out and work hard and plant them. And look at this great pasture land I found for the cows to graze in. And I'm quite a good manager, because my herds have grown, and really, it's amazing how I'm able to take care of myself. So God let them find themselves in a situation where God had to perform a miracle to bring water out of a rock, and He had to perform a miracle to put manna down for them to eat. And the sun was so scorching that He put a cloud over them, a miraculous cloud by day to shade them. Their shoes didn't wear out, and their clothes didn't wear out because they couldn't have provided any more. They were totally dependent on God. God humbled them, and He also proved them. See, He let them stay in this situation for years to find out what was really in their heart, whether they would obey Him or not. That's why the Christian life, we go through what we go through to recognize our total dependence upon God and to prove to God what's really in our heart. Are we just in it for the good times, or are we in it for all times? Deuteronomy 8 is a very good chapter to go through and read, because understand, brethren, Israel's wandering in the wilderness is an analogy to the Christian life. Paul made that very plain in Corinthians, and we went through it when we went through the book of Numbers. Have you ever wondered why God takes up so much time with... You find me another period of time when as much space in the Bible is spent covering as the events surrounding Israel's exodus and wandering in the wilderness. You've got Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy that all deal with, 4 books that deal with a period of 40 years. The book of Genesis deals with what? A couple of thousand years. Actually longer than that. About 3,500 years, really. The book of Genesis deals with one book. Most of the others deal with, certain periods. Sometimes you go through, there are places where God slows down and spends a lot of time and focuses on detail. And where He does, we need to focus to understand, why did God take up so much space? Why did He consider this so important that He stressed it in such detail? Deuteronomy 11, verse 24. Israel is told the boundaries of the promised land are to be from the river Euphrates unto the Mediterranean Sea. They're to stretch from the Euphrates. They would include the area of Lebanon and the wilderness. One of the reasons the Jews have no compunctions of invading Lebanon anytime the urge strikes them. As far as they're concerned, God gave that to them also. It says so right here in Deuteronomy 11. Menachem Begin, if you read the account, Menachem Begin used to just drive Jimmy Carter up the wall during the Camp David Accords by quoting Deuteronomy and quoting various parts of the Old Testament, which, of course, President Carter, as a good Baptist, didn't appreciate a whole lot. But Begin, that was what Begin used to negotiate from. They were negotiating on things, and Begin would turn back and give chapter and verse as to why, we took it in 67, but God gave it to us way back here. Here's the title deed. Why should I get rid of it? The title deed isn't what the UN gave us in 47. The title deed is what God gave us right here, chapter and verse. He pointed out. And it was just, it's interesting if you read some of the story, and then he'd shut the whole negotiations down on the Sabbath because he was the first practicing Jew that was a leader of Israel since independence, and so he'd shut everything down from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, which again, a good Protestant had trouble understanding. So you can imagine kind of an interesting story if you get to read the details of it sometimes. God lays emphasis in Deuteronomy chapter 12 that God would choose a place where He would set His name. And this is where people are to look. Stressing the fact that God is a God of organization. And that people are not just to go charging off and do their own thing. The warning in the end of Deuteronomy 12, a very important few verses, verses 30 through 32. Why is it okay? The people, like when they celebrate Christmas and Easter and all these things, and they say, and you start telling them, they run it in the newspapers every year that these are pagan origin. And you tell people that, or you call their attention to it, and they say, yeah, but we don't do it for that reason. That's not why we do it. Deuteronomy 12, verse 30 says, take heed to yourself that you be not snared by following them after that they be destroyed from before you. Don't inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. You shall not do so unto the eternal your God, for every abomination to the Lord which He hates have they done unto their God. That makes it very plain, Deuteronomy 12, right here. God does not want us to serve Him the way the pagans serve their God. Don't go out and look and find all these pagan customs and say, oh, isn't that cute? Why don't we do that? Call it by a different name. What difference does it make? Deuteronomy 12 tells you. It says it makes a difference to God. Chapter 13 really kind of continues some of the same material. What if somebody arises among you and performs miracles? Is the fulfillment of a prophecy or a miracle the real test of whether or not someone is a messenger sent from God? No. The real test is Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 5. If he doesn't teach obedience to the law of God, he's not God's messenger. Satan can work lying wonders. The whole world is going to be deceived in a matter of a few years. Well, the world's already deceived. But they're going to be deceived in a different way. They're going to all give heed to the false prophet, considering that individual is the great power of God. And it said, if it were possible, even the very elect would be deceived. It's going to be so impressive. It's going to seem so right to everyone, except it's going to be wrong. And how are you going to know? If they speak not according to the law and to the testimony, it's because there's no truth in it. God does not contradict Himself. He doesn't give one message through this fellow and another message through that fellow, and you've got all these contradictory things going. In Deuteronomy 14, we have instructions on tithing. God emphasized in chapter 12 there would be a central place that He would choose. Chapter 14, he opens the chapter by focusing in on things to be eaten and not eaten. And then in verse 23, or verse 22, he begins to focus in on tithing. Now, earlier in the book of Numbers, we had read where God gave the tithe to the Levites for their service that they rendered in the tabernacle. So we read in the book of Deuteronomy, or in the book of Numbers, of where God said that He had given the Levites all the tithe in Israel for the service that they served there in the tabernacle, there, or later on as it was in the temple. But that's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 21. I've given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance, for their service which they served, even the service of the tabernacle. Now, we call that the first tithe. The reason we call it first tithe is because it's the first one mentioned. The one you read back in Genesis 14 where Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. Later Jacob promised that if God would bless him, he would tithe. He understood that it was something converted people did. His father and grandfather had done it. Tithing is at no point introduced as a new practice. It's simply we come upon it as an ongoing custom. In Genesis 14. God did not introduce tithing in Numbers 18. It was something that had been in existence all along, but now God made a distinction as to where the tithe was to go. Abraham had paid it to Melchizedek, but now there was a different priesthood, the Levitical priesthood being instituted, and God said, the tithe, which is mine, I'm going to pay to the Levites. Now, in Deuteronomy 14, we read of a different tithe. Because here, it says in verse 23 of Deuteronomy 14, you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place which ye shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of your corn, of your wine, of your oil, of the firstlings of your herds and of your flocks, that you may learn to fear the eternal your God always. Here's a tithe that the individual is to eat before God. It's not the tithe that goes to the Levites. We call it a second tithe because it's the second one mentioned. That's also, incidentally, what the Jews call it. They don't practice it. They use the excuse that the temple is destroyed and they don't have a Levite around to give it to them. That's their excuse, you know. As Christ told the Pharisees, they were very good at coming up with loopholes in the law, you know. They say that, when the Messiah comes back and the temple is rebuilt, they will tithe again. Which is very true. They just don't know how true that is, you see. They think that by saying that they're kind of putting it off in Never Never Land, they'll never have to reckon with it. But they will have a surprise in a matter of a few years. But we focus here in Deuteronomy 14 on a second tithe, a different tithe. Not the one that went to the Levites, but ones individuals kept and saved and were to consume before God when they went to rejoice before God in the place that he had set his name. Now, when do you do that and how often? Well, that's made plain in Deuteronomy 16:16. 3 times, 3 seasons in the year, shall all your males appear before the Lord your God in the place which he shall choose. Oh, that's when you come to the place where God chooses. See, it says in Deuteronomy 14:23, you eat it before the Lord your God in the place which he shall choose. Well, how often do you do that and when? It doesn't say in Deuteronomy 14, but if you go a couple of, just another chapter or so down in Deuteronomy 16, verse 16, it says, 3 times in a year shall all your males appear before the Lord your God in the place which he shall choose. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, which is upcoming, and the Feast of Tabernacles, you shall not appear before the Lord empty. So, that is a summary. We saw in Deuteronomy 16, it gives more details on the festival. So these 3 occasions, the 3 festival seasons, are the times we're to appear before God in the place which he shall choose. How do we afford to do that? Deuteronomy 14 gives us the detail. We set aside a tithe that we utilize in that way. We're to use it for ourselves, and we're also to remember those within our gates who are less fortunate and have no inheritance. Then in verse 28 of Deuteronomy 14, at the end of 3 years, you shall bring forth all the tithe of your increase the same year, and shall lay it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no part nor inheritance with you, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within your gates, shall come and shall be satisfied, and the Lord your God shall bless you. Now here is a third tithe mentioned. It's not the one that God said was to be paid to the Levites for their service in the tabernacle. It's not the one the individual saved and ate before God in the festival seasons. Rather, it is one that is not brought forth year by year. You see, Deuteronomy 14:22 talks about a tithe of the increase that the field brings forth year by year. Well, Deuteronomy 14:28 talks about one at the end of 3 years, a tithe of just that year's produce. Now, when you come on down to chapter 15 and verse 1, at the end of every 7 years, you shall make a release. So this was at the end of 3 years. This was during a 7-year cycle. Ancient Israel was on a 7-year cycle. Every 7 years, the land lay fallow. So it was the 3rd year and the 6th year of a 7-year cycle that they tithed this 3rd time. The 7th year didn't count because it was the year of release. It was the year when the land lay fallow. And even though every Israelite was not engaged in agriculture, so many of them were, that it would, you see, if the 3rd tithe year had gone in an unbroken cycle, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, what would have happened when it came out on 21? It would have coincided with a sabbatical year, and that would have meant there wouldn't have been anything. Because 10% of nothing is nothing. And so then, there would have been a great gap there that the widows and the fatherless and whatever wouldn't have been provided for. So, it was set up on the 7-year cycle. On the agricultural cycle, the whole nation was put on the same cycle, though, of course, various ones in Israel were not strictly farmers. And so the sabbatical year, at least in terms of rest of the land, didn't apply to them in the same way, because maybe they were a craftsman, or they were a merchant, or they were something else. So they would have applied their trade, just as the farmer worked during the sabbatical year. He used it as a year of repair on his farm buildings and upkeep and various things of that sort. It was not, but it was not. It was a year for the land to rest. It was a part of the economic laws God gave Israel, part of the laws that dealt with ecology, that you're not to wear the land out. You know, we've got all over this state worn out farmland. Particularly, you know, there are many areas of this state. They grew cotton on it year after year after year after year, and now you do well to grow a few blades of grass or a pine tree, because they just simply wore it out. I'll take you up to Bienville Parish, where I grew up, and you can look and see the the state of things. At one time, it was a very productive area, but it was farmed. It simply could not sustain it. Some of the river parishes and areas there along the delta and things like that, where the soil was much richer, you could get by with abusing it for a much longer period of time. But there are certain principles that God built in to the system. Okay. Deuteronomy 17. In Deuteronomy 17, there's a reference to future kings and what God told the kings that they were not to do. Was they were not to multiply wives, not to multiply horses, not to multiply silver and gold. No. They were not to cause the people to return back to Egypt. God did not want huge standing armies or great wealth concentrated in the hands of a central government, because of the temptations to mischief that would result. It just simply leads to problems. God gave the king a good job. He was to write out a copy of the law, which is before the priest. He would have spent his time copying the Bible, making his own handwritten copy. Of course, they didn't have printing presses, see, so you had to get it handwritten. You had to get any copy you had it handwritten. But God told the king, don't have the scribe copy you out one, you sit down and copy. That would have kept him busy and off the streets and out of trouble, and would have been a far more productive use of his time than what most of them put their time to. You wouldn't have time to get into a lot of trouble, if you had to sit down. When you finish copying the Bible, then you can go out and play, Then by that time, the king would be too old to get into a whole lot of trouble, and the nation would have remained at peace. But as we get a little further into the book of Samuel and Kings, we will find how well the kings heeded this advice, and we'll notice the consequences. In Deuteronomy 18:15, there is the reference to Christ, the prophecy of the Messiah, a prophet that God will raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me. This is quoted in Acts 3:22 and in Acts 7:37 as a reference to Christ. We began then to get into a number of civil laws, a number of things that pertain here. In chapter 19, it had to do with the cities of refuge. The criminal justice system was that the next of kin had the responsibility akin to what we would call the district attorney. He was responsible to prosecute a crime. The crime of violence had been committed. He was responsible to prosecute the crime. He was the avenger of blood. He was responsible to pursue the slayer. What the individual was to do was they were to go to a city of refuge. Now, the cities of refuge were presided over by the Levites. And then when the avenger of blood had tracked the slayer down to the city of refuge, the Levites, the judges, heard the case, made a decision. If it were murder, then the individual was taken out and was stoned. The avenger of blood, the one who made the accusation, had to throw the first stone. And the rest of the community had to join in. If it was determined that the slaying was accidental, it was not a premeditated murder, it's what we would term a manslaughter or accidental homicide, then the person was allowed to remain in the city of refuge. He couldn't leave. He was subject to being executed if he left. He was in effect confined. It was not prison as we know prisons, because he could have his family there and live and function, but he was in a city that was filled with others like himself, presided over by the Levites. And he was confined there until the death of the high priest. So the emphasis was that the judges, verse 18, were to make diligent inquisition. And if a witness is a false witness and has testified falsely against his brother, then shall you do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. I wonder how much perjury we would have in this land if the penalty for perjury in the United States today were that you would have done unto you whatever would have been done to the fellow whom you were testifying against if your testimony had been believed. It would tend to make a person think twice before he perjured himself. If you perjured yourself in a murder trial, and it turned out that you had perjured yourself, you were the guy they took out and stoned. Because you were, in effect, you were trying to commit murder. You were lying to have somebody convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And if it was a capital crime, then you would have been responsible for his murder. So, it was just a matter that intent here is punishable. It says, your eye shall not pity, verse 21. Life shall go for life. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now this is an expression that means the punishment shall fit the crime. You can go through specifics and find out that there were actually, if someone was injured and lost an eye or a hand, that in reality what they did was a fine was levied. But the term eye for eye simply means the punishment fits the crime. You don't make the punishment a lot greater than the crime. You don't make the punishment a lot less than the crime. The principle of punishment is that punishment should fit the crime. The severity of the punishment should fit the severity of the crime. The more damage you do, the more you should be penalized. Your eye is not to pity. Life shall go for life. It's an important principle, one we've ignored in this country. We say that the death penalty doesn't deter. Well, the way it's carried out, it doesn't. But I'll tell you what, if it was carried out the way God said here, it would have been a deterrent. Number one, it would have deterred all those that committed the crime, because they would have been executed, and that would have been a complete deterrent for them ever doing it again. It would have deterred them first and foremost, plus the fact that when something is carried out, and it's swiftly and surely carried out time after time, and everybody knows it, it doesn't happen very often. What was it, in Malaysia back, wasn't it a year or two ago, when they executed a couple of Australians for smuggling drugs in? Made headlines all over the world. Everybody got upset about it because they have a death penalty for that there. But one of the reasons it made news is because it so rarely happens. You see, that's what they do every time it does, and as a result, the number of people that die that they have to put to death in Malaysia for smuggling drugs is very minimal. A lot less than the number of people that die of overdose in the United States, on a regular basis. And so we were appalled at their barbarity, but some strange reason they don't have a problem over there. Once every few years, one or two people come wandering in and get executed, and it serves to make believers out of everybody else. So, there's something to be said here. We note the principle here, in as it goes on through various other civil laws. Deuteronomy 22, it talks about if you see somebody's animals go astray, you're not to ignore it. If you find them, you're to take care of them and try to get them back. Verse 5 makes plain that men are to be masculine in terms of appearance and dress. Women are to be feminine. Notice in verse 6, even just a principle of ecology. A lot of miscellaneous laws, just principles stuck in here. Verse 6, if a bird's nest chance to be before you in the way, or in any tree or on the ground, where there be young ones or eggs, the dam sitting upon the young or upon the egg, you don't take the dam with the young. You're not to, you're to be careful here that if it's the eggs of a clean bird, yeah, you can take the eggs and eat the eggs, but you don't kill the mother bird too. Leave her alone; she'll lay more, and things go on. So you don't. It is a principle of conservation. You don't kill the mother. That's what you go out and you kill the mother and you wipe out the species. You let them go. Notice in verse 8, when you build a new house, when you make a battlement, you shall make a battlement for your roof, that you bring not blood upon your house, if any man fall from things. The houses that they built, of course, normally had a flat roof. Principles of just liability. God says, look, if you build a house and you've got a flat roof up there, build a barrier around it. You put a wall up, where a railing, so that somebody doesn't wander up to the edge and fall over. There's a principle of liability. So there are many principles that were brought out here. The brings out in terms of Deuteronomy 23:15, you shall not deliver unto his master the servant that is escaped from his master unto you. So this was the runaway, an escaped slave was not to be forcibly returned. Question here about tithing on the sale of a dog. This is years ago. I remember that a man who raised and sold dogs for a living read this scripture in Deuteronomy 23:17 and or Deuteronomy 23:18 rather, and he was concerned as to whether or not it was that he could send in tithes on that because it says you're not to bring the price of a dog into the house of the Lord your God. Does that mean if you sell dogs you shouldn't give an offering on it or tithe? Well, no. What's made plain is you read the context here and you do a little research. The term dog was a slang term in Hebrew that referred to a sodomite or a male prostitute. We use the feminine form today as a slang term in English. The term here was just it was used in the masculine in Hebrew, and so that was what it had reference to. Not to a literal four-legged dog. As we come on down, principles in Deuteronomy 24 that deal with divorce, Christ commented on those, of course, in Matthew 19. Principle of gleaning brought out in Deuteronomy 24. When you harvested your field, you were to go over it once. Don't go back and try to get every last bit. It was left for the strangers and for the poor, for the needy. They were able to go out and glean the field. Kind of the original workfare system. Not really welfare, but workfare. It was a matter that there was provision made for the needy, but they had to put forth effort in order to derive benefit. Various principles here as it comes on down through Deuteronomy 25 and 26 that deals with tithing. And then in chapter 27, Moses told the elders to set up great stones and plaster them with plaster and to write the words of this law, and that the Israelites were, this was instructed there in Mount Ebal. They were to build an altar, and they were lined up, the Israelites. Some of them were in Mount Gerizim and some were in Mount Ebal, and the blessings and the cursings were read out. And that is described here. They set up these huge stones and plastered them and inscribed the book of the law as a memorial marker. This was done right at the entrance into the land to impress upon the people the necessity of obeying God's law. We come on here through the blessings and the cursings, the things that would happen if they obeyed, the things that would happen if they disobeyed. Much of our economic problems in the U.S. today are prophesied right here in Deuteronomy 28, verse 43. It says, "The stranger that is within you shall get up above you very high, and you shall come down very low. He shall lend to you, and you shall not lend to him. He shall be the head, and you shall be the tail." We're finding a situation right now where all the foreign investment that's coming into this country, the fact that the United States has gone from being a lender nation to being a borrower nation, the greatest debtor nation on the face of the earth, prophesied right here. Things would be turned upside down. That God said, in effect told Israel, look, you're on top because I put you on top. You don't serve me and acknowledge that, and you're going to find yourself on the bottom. So this is a part of the curse that's coming on this nation. In terms of the various geographical divisions of racial and national groupings, we find the statement in Deuteronomy 32, verse 7, "Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations, ask your father and he'll show you, your elders and they will tell you, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when He separated the sons of Adam." He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. God originally separated the sons of Adam. He divided to the nations their inheritance. He did so before the flood, and redid so again after the flood. Used language and various geographical boundaries to establish that. It's not a matter of accident or happenstance. God's purpose, for the purpose of making prophecy come about. God had a great plan that He was working out, so He put different people in different areas they came in contact with certain ones. It fits in an overview of the overall plan and purpose that God had. We find these blessings and cursings on through chapter 28 and chapter 29 even, the things that were going to happen. And then continuing on in chapter 30, and the call to repentance. And God told them in Deuteronomy 30 verse 19, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you. I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose life that you and your seed may live. So God made it very plain what Israel was to choose, what they were to do. And in verse 9 of chapter 31, Moses wrote this law. He delivered it to the Levites. Verse 10, he commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity of the year of release, in the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel is come to appear before the Lord your God in the place he shall choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. And so this was the case. What was to happen to the book of Deuteronomy and the entire law after it was written? Well, it was to be read every 7 years. But we also see here in Deuteronomy 31:26, take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. Moses gave this to the Levites and told them that it was to be kept there. Then chapter 33 concludes with the blessing that Moses gave, and chapter 34 is the account of Moses' death. If I could get some assistance to pass out the study questions on the book of Joshua. We have here in Deuteronomy a summary of God's working and dealing through Moses with the people of Israel. The final warnings that God gave them before they entered into the promised land, before Moses died and Joshua took over. We're going to, I think it's important that we focus on that, realizing the admonitions and the warnings. The tendency, you see, is for people over a period of time to water things down and to begin to compromise. The tendency of human nature is to water down. Deuteronomy is filled with injunctions. Don't water it down. Don't compromise. Don't do these things. It is a restating of the law prior to going into the promised land. It is an emphasis of the things that the lay people in Israel needed to be reminded of on a regular basis. It is a summary. It is a good place to go on a regular basis for us in our studies, realizing that it's what God had put together as a summary and what was reread time and time again there to Israel. Next Bible study, we will have the opportunity of going into the book of Joshua and beginning to focus there, and again, seeing many lessons and parallels that apply to us today. That will conclude the Bible study. I have one announcement. Anyone who is making a co-op order or a Tupperware payment, you can check with Patty Carter right after Bible study.